Welcome to today's story, The Final Standstill, generated by StoryWave.ai. March 2024. Please tap that like button, share, and subscribe for more. Chapter 1, Echoes of the Enemy. I lay there in the trench, the cold mud seeping through my uniform, the stars above obscured by a veil of darkness thicker than I'd ever seen. It was as if the sky itself were conspiring with the enemy, shrouding their movements in mystery. James Callahan bulldogged to us, stared out into the void, his blue eyes searching for something, anything, that might give us a hint of what was to come. The night was oddly still, the usual turmoil of war, replaced by a silence so profound it felt almost like a living thing. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, each pulse a reminder of the fragility of our situation. "Anything on the wire, Tommy?" Bulldog's voice cut through the stillness, his tone betraying none of the tension that gripped my insides like a vice. Thomas Keller, our radio operator, was hunched over his equipment, the glow from the dials casting eerie shadows across his face. "It's all garbled, James. I can't make heads or tails of it," he replied, his fingers working frantically to untangle the web of static and cryptic signals. Miguel Ramirez, Doc as we all called him, moved from man to man, his green eyes filled with a calm that seemed out of place in this maelstrom of uncertainty. "Keep your heads down and stay sharp," he murmured, his voice a soothing balm against the backdrop of our anxieties. Chen Wei and his troops were out there, somewhere in the inky blackness, planning something big. I could feel it in my bones. The whispers we'd caught, the fragments of sentences, they hinted at an onslaught, but the specifics eluded us, dancing just beyond our grasp like shadows at the edge of our vision. "We need to know what they're up to," I muttered, more to myself than to anyone else. Bulldog nodded, chewing on a matchstick, his stoic facade as unbreakable as ever. "We'll know soon enough. They can't hide in the dark forever." Tommy's voice broke through again, tinged with frustration. "I think I've got something, but it's like trying to read smoke. The words are there, then they're not. It's maddening. We need clarity, Tommy." "Dig deeper," Bulldog instructed, his gruff voice leaving no room for argument. I peered out into the night, my rifle at the ready. As if by sheer will, I could pierce the veil and see the danger that lurked beyond. Scouts had reported movement, unusual tactics that didn't fit the usual patterns. And now this silence, it felt like the calm before a storm, a prelude to chaos. Hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. The tension among the men was palpable, a thick fog of unease that settled over us, suffocating and relentless. And then, a sound, a faint echo in the distance, the metallic clink of something sinister. My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced at Bulldog, his expression unchanged, but I knew he'd heard it too. "Positions," he barked suddenly, and we all snapped to attention, our training taking over where our fear left off. In the darkness we waited, the unknown threat hanging over us like a guillotine, ready to drop at any moment. The enemy was close. I could feel it in the marrow of my bones, a primal understanding that something terrible was on the horizon. As the sky began to lighten, the first hints of dawn creeping over the mountains, the silence continued to press down on us, a tyrannical force that seemed to mock our readiness. "We're missing something," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "They're planning something we're not seeing." Bulldog met my gaze, the first hint of doubt flickering in his eyes. "Then we hold the line, until we can't. We're Marines. That's what we do." The sky turned a pale gray, the promise of a new day tainted by the fear of what it might bring. And in that moment, I knew that we were standing on the precipice of something monumental, a battle that would test our very souls. But we were the 1st Marine Division, and we'd face whatever came with the grit and willpower that had become our hallmark. We would stand firm together against the echoes of the enemy, no matter what form they took. And as the sun peeked over the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the cusp of a tragedy, the kind that would leave its mark on history, a stark reminder of the cost of war. But for now, we waited, our willpower as unyielding as the ground beneath our feet. Chapter 2. Breath before the plunge. "Hey, you gonna write that letter or just daydream about it?" Thomas, his voice tinged with a quiver of nervous energy, nudged me from my stupor. I could see the faint outline of his glasses reflecting the dim light. Just getting my thoughts together, I replied, forcing a smile. James, standing tall like the steadfast leader we'd come to rely on, clapped me on the shoulder. Take your time, but remember, these letters might mean the world to someone back home. I nodded, the weight of his words settling in my stomach like a stone. The pen finally started to move, the words flowing out, a mix of hope and fear, promises and farewells. It was a surreal moment, the act of writing to loved ones, with the specter of battle looming over us like an ominous cloud. Miguel came over, his dark brown hair sticking out in all directions, a sign of another sleepless night spent tending to the men. It's strange, isn't it? How life seems to narrow down to a few sheets of paper on the eve of something like this. James glanced at him, the corners of his eyes crinkling. Yeah, it makes you think about what's waiting for us on the other side of this fight. Their conversation unfolded, heart-to-heart exchanges that revealed the depth of their camaraderie. They talked of home, of dreams deferred, and the future, a future uncertain but always worth fighting for. The chatter amongst the men turned to whispers of the enemy's numbers. They say the Chinese have us outnumbered, one of the newer recruits muttered, his voice barely above the wind that whipped through our encampment. Numbers ain't everything, James countered with a confidence that seemed to pull the tension tight, like a bowstring ready to snap. We've got grit and guts on our side, but his words did little to stifle the unease that rippled through the ranks. Rumors had a way of growing, of becoming monsters in their own right. We all knew the fight ahead would test us, that the overwhelming force we faced could be the anvil on which our endurance would either hold firm or shatter. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across our preparations, I folded my letter, sealing within it all my unspoken words, my hopes and my fears. I looked around at these men, my brothers in arms, each locked in their own silent battles as they wrote their own letters, set their own mental defenses. The day wore on, the hours slipping by with an urgency that seemed to mock our waiting. We checked and rechecked our weapons, ran through drills, and bolstered our spirits with tales of past victories and laughter that rang hollow against the backdrop of our anxiety. Nightfall came, and with it, a hush as profound as the darkness itself. We lay in our foxholes and on our cots, the quiet punctuated by the occasional rustle of a body shifting, the clink of a dog tag against a rifle stock. In the stillness, I could hear my own breath, each inhale and exhale a corroboration to the life I still held within me, a life I was prepared to lay down for my country, for these men, for a world that seemed both infinitely vast and painfully small in the face of the unknown. We were on the breath before the plunge, the precipice of a moment that would define us, that would carve our names into the commentary of history or erase us from memory altogether. And as I closed my eyes, I found a sliver of peace in the thought that no matter what the dawn brought, we would face it together, as Marines, as brothers, with hearts unyielding and spirits indomitable. Chapter 3, First Blood. I scrambled to my feet, my ears ringing from the blasts. To arms, to arms. James's voice cut through the confusion, his figure outlined against the bursts of light, his anchor tattoo flexing with the movement of his arm as he rallied us. We poured out of our foxholes and shelters, grabbing our rifles, our hearts pounding in our chests, the air filled with the acrid smell of explosives and the cries of men readying themselves for a fight. Tommy, get that radio working. We need air support. James barked orders, his gruff voice steady even as the earth shook around us. I'm on it, James. Just give me a sec. Tommy's hands flew over the dials, his glasses slipping down his nose in his haste. The sky was ablaze, each flash painting our surroundings in stark relief. Sandbags, barbed wire, the stark faces of my brothers in arms. We were a picture of urgency, a tableau of men cast into sudden battle. Doc, stick close. We're gonna need you. I yelled over the discord, finding Miguel's face in the chaos. He nodded, his medical kit already in hand, the green of his eyes almost glowing with determination. The ground jolted violently again, a direct hit nearby sending a shower of dirt and debris over us. I felt a sharp sting on my cheek and tasted dirt in my mouth. Pushing the fear down, I locked eyes with James. We push back, now, he commanded, and like a tide, we surged forward, our boots slipping in the mud as we moved to meet the enemy. The night was alight with the flash of gunfire, the staccato of rifles a deadly rhythm. We advanced, a line of resolve in the face of the onslaught, covering fire. James's voice was a lantern, guiding us through the disarray. We found cover where we could, returning fire, the reports of our rifles a chorus of defiance. I saw James's stocky form moving amongst us, a pillar of strength, his rifle barking as he led a countercharge against a pocket of enemy soldiers who had breached our line. An explosion nearby sent a Marine tumbling to the ground. "Man down!" The shout cut through the noise. Miguel was there in an instant, his body a shield as he tended to the fallen soldier, his hands deft and sure even as bullets whizzed past. The battle raged, a maelstrom of violence and chaos, but we held our ground, pushing back against the tide that sought to engulf us. "We're holding them." I heard Thomas shout, relief and disbelief mingling in his voice. The night wore on, and the enemy's fire began to wane, their initial fervor dampened by our unyielding defense. As the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, the battlefield fell silent, the enemy retreating like shadows before the light. We were battered, bruised, but unbowed. James stood among us, his sandy blonde hair plastered to his forehead, his blue eyes taking in the men he had led through hell and back. We had drawn first blood, but at what cost? Around us, the scars of battle were all too evident, the craters, the smoldering remains of our defenses, the wounded and the fallen. Miguel emerged from the smoke, the soldier he had saved propped up beside him, alive thanks to his bravery. "We did it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, an instrument to the ordeal we had just endured. We gathered our wits, our strength, and our resolve. We knew this was but the opening act of a longer, more brutal fight. But for now, we stood together in the quiet of dawn's light, the taste of victory bittersweet on our tongues, the echoes of battle still ringing in our ears. As the sun rose, casting long shadows over the scarred landscape, I knew that this was the reality of war, a reality that we had faced and would face again. And in that moment, I understood that we were not just fighting for our lives, but for each other, for the bond that held us together amidst the chaos. This was the final standstill, where every moment could be our last, where every action could tip the scales. And as the light grew stronger, I gripped my rifle and prepared for what was to come, knowing that whatever the future held, we would meet it as one. Chapter 4. Into the Valley of Shadow. James was the first to move, his stocky frame barreling down the embattled slope, shouting orders over the pandemonium. "Move, move. We need to reach the valley before they cut us off." I glanced at Miguel, who was by my side in an instant, dragging a wounded comrade. "We can't leave them," he said, his voice strained but determined as he hefted the soldier over his shoulders. The retreat was chaos, a desperate scramble as the enemy's pressure mounted. The sky roared with the thunder of artillery, and the ground shook with each new assault. We were a living stream, pouring down into the valley that promised a moment's respite. "Tommy, radio in our position. We need that air cover now more than ever," I heard James call out. "On it, but it's rough with all this interference." Tommy's fingers worked the radio as if it were a lifeline, his usually anxious voice now edged with steely focus. As we reached the relative shelter of the valley, a new horror greeted us. An ammo dump we'd relied on for resupply had taken a direct hit, its contents igniting in a fiery roar that sent shockwaves through our ranks. "We've got to keep moving." James's command cut through the stunned silence that followed the explosion. "Set up a perimeter at the next ridge." I helped Miguel with the wounded, laying them out with as much care as we could muster under the circumstances. "James, we're running on fumes here," I said, my voice hoarse with exertion and smoke. "We do what we can with what we've got. That's the Marine way, isn't it?" His reply was firm, but I caught the briefest flicker of concern in his blue eyes. The valley became a makeshift haven as we regrouped. The sounds of battle, a constant reminder of the enemy's persistence. Chen Wei's forces were relentless, a tidal wave of soldiers spurred on by their commander's unyielding will. We could hear their shouts, their commanders barking orders in a language we didn't need to understand to feel its intent. Miguel was a flurry of motion, moving from one wounded Marine to the next, his soothing voice a counterpoint to the grim tasks at hand. "How are we holding up, Doc?" James approached, his expression grim. "Doing what I can, but we need a break. And I don't mean a coffee one," Miguel replied, his hands never stopping as he bandaged a bloody leg. James nodded, his gaze sweeping over the men who had become more than soldiers under his command. They were his responsibility, his to protect. The day wore on, and the valley of shadow grew darker as the enemy drew nearer. We braced ourselves for their advance, our weapons at the ready, our spirits bolstered by the knowledge that retreat wasn't an option. As night began to fall, the valley was eerily quiet, the lull before the storm we all knew was coming. We sat in our positions, rifles in hand, waiting for what the darkness would bring. James crouched beside me, his presence a silent statement of solidarity. "We stand together, no matter what comes down that hill," he said, his gaze fixed on the shadowed ridge above us. I nodded, my grip on my rifle tightening. "Together," I echoed, and the word was a vow, a promise made not just to James, but to every Marine who had ever worn the uniform. The tension was a living thing, wrapping around us as the hours passed, the anticipation of conflict a weight in the pit of my stomach. And as the first stars peeked through the night sky, I knew that this valley would witness either our greatest stand or our most tragic fall. Chapter 5: A Dragon's Wrath. James crouched by a large oak, his rifle cradled in his arms, his gaze scanning the tree line. "Keep your eyes peeled and your heads down. We're not alone in these woods," he whispered, his voice a low rumble that barely reached my ears. I nodded, pressing my back against the rough bark of a tree, my rifle clutched tightly. The forest was a mosaic of light and dark, the leaves a canopy that both shielded and suffocated. Suddenly, a crack echoed through the trees, an unnatural sound that made my heart lurch. "Sniper!" The shout was followed by the thud of a body hitting the ground. Miguel was there in an instant, but there was nothing he could do. The sniper's bullet had found its mark with chilling precision. "We can't stay here," he said, his green eyes dark with urgency. "We need to move, but where?" I asked, trying to keep the panic from my voice. James was already on the radio, his blue eyes fierce with concentration. "Command, this is Bulldog. We're sitting ducks out here, requesting permission to move to Point Echo." The radio crackled, and the voice that answered was stern, the voice of a man looking at maps rather than the shadowed woods. "Negative, Bulldog. Hold your position. Reinforcements are en route." James's jaw clenched. "With all due respect, sir, by the time they get here we might all be dead." The line was silent for a moment before the reply came. "That's an order, Bulldog." James slammed the radio down, his frustration as palpable as the danger that surrounded us. "We hold," he said, his voice barely containing his anger. We spread out, each of us finding what cover we could, our eyes darting from tree to tree, our fingers ready on the triggers. The forest was no longer a place of nature's beauty, but a battlefield of shadows and fear. As the day wore on, the sniper's presence became a constant threat, a pressure that squeezed at our chests with every breath. We were the hunted, and Chen Wei, the cunning dragon, was breathing down our necks with every hour that passed. "James, we can't keep this up," I said during a rare moment of quiet. "They're picking us off one by one." "We don't have a choice," James replied, his blue eyes steely. "We're Marines. We follow orders, and we protect our own." The sound of a twig snapping sent us all into high alert, rifles aimed at the source. But it was just a deer, its large eyes filled with a fear that mirrored our own, before it bounded away. As the sun began to dip below the treetops, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for us with dark fingers, the tension rose to a fever pitch. We knew that nightfall would bring more danger, more unseen threats. The air grew colder, and the woods grew quieter, as if the very earth was holding its breath, waiting for the next crack of a sniper's rifle to shatter the silence. In the fading light, we were a band of brothers, holding on to each other and to the hope that somehow we would survive the dragon's wrath. But as darkness enveloped us, that hope seemed as frail as the light that had abandoned the sky, leaving us in a night filled with unseen eyes and the cold certainty of a struggle that was far from over. Chapter 6: Fading Resolve. James paced back and forth, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. He stopped in front of us, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Listen up, we've got a supply drop incoming. It's crucial. We need those supplies if we're going to hold out." The men's gazes followed the path of a solitary plane droning in the distance, our hopes hitching a ride on the faint parachute that should have been bringing much-needed food and ammo. But as we watched, the drop veered off course, carried away by a merciless wind. The critical supplies we had been waiting for landed with a mocking thud far beyond our reach. A collective groan rose from the men, the disappointment a tangible thing that seemed to sap our already waning strength. "Can't we get to it?" Thomas asked, his voice tinged with desperation as he adjusted his glasses, which had fogged up from the cold. "It's too risky." "No man's land is crawling with snipers," James replied, his blue eyes scanning the treacherous terrain between us and the lost supplies. I looked around at the faces of my fellow Marines, saw the shadows of doubt and the glint of fear. We were hungry, cold, and the enemy was out there, waiting. "James, what are we even doing here?" One of the younger Marines blurted out, his voice cracking. "We're freezing. We've got no food, and now no ammo. How are we supposed to fight like this?" James stopped in front of the young Marine, his presence commanding even in this bleak hour. "We're here because we've been given a job to do. We're Marines, and we don't back down, not from the enemy, and not from a little cold." "But it ain't just a little cold, James," Miguel chimed in, his hands working to massage warmth back into a frostbitten hand. "These boys are hurting. If we don't get them proper food and shelter soon," James's gaze met Miguel's, and for a moment, the unspoken gravity of our situation hung between them. "Then we'll make do, Doc. We always do." The conversation lapsed into silence, each man lost in his own thoughts as the snow began to fall again, covering the world in a blanket of white that muffled sound and hope alike. As the day wore on, the cold seeped into our bones, a constant companion that whispered of an easier path, surrender. But surrender wasn't in our nature, not when there was still breath in our bodies and fight in our spirits. Nightfall brought no relief, only a deeper chill that settled in our hearts. We huddled around small fires, the flames fighting a losing battle against the encroaching frost. I sat next to Miguel, watching as he tended to the increasing number of frostbite cases, his hands steady but his eyes filled with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "How do you keep going, Doc?" I asked, my voice barely above the crackle of the fire. Miguel looked up, his green eyes reflecting the flames. "Because they need me to. Because if I stop, that's when hope dies, and I'll be damned if I'm the one to kill it." His words struck a chord, and around the fire heads nodded, the staunchness rekindling in the eyes of the men. James stood, his silhouette outlined by the firelight. "We'll get through this, just like we've gotten through everything else. We're not just fighting for our country, we're fighting for each other. And that's worth every shiver, every empty belly, every moment of doubt. We are Marines, and we will endure." The men's murmurs of agreement were a soft chorus in the darkness, a vow made not in the light of day, but in the shadow of night, when the truth of our staunchness was laid bare. As sleep claimed us, one by one, the snow continued to fall, a silent testament to the changing world around us. But within our circle, the fire still burned, a small illuminator of warmth in a cold and unforgiving land. And though our staunchness may have faded with the light, it was not extinguished, it waited, ready to be reignited with the dawn. Chapter 7, Ambush at Hell's Pass. "Stay sharp," James ordered, his eyes scanning the ridges above. This pass could be a perfect spot for enmenoting. His words were cut off as the crack of gunfire erupted from the cliffs overhead. Bullets rained down, chipping rock and kicking up dust all around us. "Ambush!" I yelled, ducking behind a boulder as a spray of dirt showered over me. The pass had become a death trap, the enemy hidden high above, their guns speaking in thunderous roars. "We need to push through," James shouted back, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Miguel was already darting between the injured, dragging them to relative safety. "Hang in there, buddy," he reassured a young Marine with a bloody shoulder, his hands swift and sure as he applied a bandage. Thomas banged on his radio, frustration etched on his face as he tried to send out a distress call. Come on," he muttered, the radio's static a grim reply to his efforts. The pass was a maelstrom, each of us caught in the struggle to move forward, to survive the hail of gunfire from an unseen foe. Covering fire. James's command was a lifeline, and we grasped it, returning fire blindly toward the cliffs, hoping to suppress the enemy long enough to escape the pass. "Thomas, we need that air support," James called out again, ducking as a shard of rock whizzed past his head. It's no good, Thomas shouted back, his hands clenched in frustration. The signal's jammed. We're on our own. The realization hit us like a physical blow. Cut off, outnumbered, our situation was growing more desperate by the second. Fall back. James's new order was a reluctant one, but necessary. We retreated, dragging our wounded, our progress measured in inches and paid for in blood. The enemy's gunfire seemed to grow fiercer, and the pass echoed with the sounds of battle, each echo a grim reminder of our plight. We huddled behind whatever cover we could find, the cold seeping into our bones, the weight of our situation pressing down on us. James, what are we going to do? I asked, the question burning in my throat. We're going to survive, he said, his voice a hardened edge of resolve. We've made it this far, and we're not giving up now. Miguel joined us, his face smeared with dirt and blood. We need a plan, and fast. They've got the high ground, but there's got to be a way out of this. Together, we weighed our options, our voices low and urgent amidst the din of gunfire. We could try to outflank them, or wait for darkness and slip away under the cover of night. As we talked, the gunfire intensified, a relentless pounding that seemed to shake the very ground beneath us. We were trapped in Beep's Pass, the enemy closing in, our options dwindling. But as long as we had breath in our lungs and fight in our hearts, we would not yield. This was the final standstill, and we would stand together, come what may. Chapter 8, A Glacial Grave. James stood by a makeshift marker, his breath forming clouds that were quickly torn apart by the biting wind. Let's get a count, he said, his voice void of its usual strength. His eyes, a piercing blue even in the dim light, were fixed on the horizon, as if searching for answers in the endless expanse of white. I moved from one still form to the next, my heart heavy, my tally growing with each step. The silence was punctuated by the soft sounds of our movement and the occasional clink of dog tags being collected, a jarring chorus to the tragedy before us. We're down to 30, I finally reported, my voice a hoarse whisper swallowed by the vastness around us. Thomas was hunched over his radio, trying once again to pierce the veil of isolation that had descended upon us. I can't get through to anyone, he said, frustration lacing his words. It's like we're on our own planet out here. Miguel knelt in the snow, a dark contrast against the white, his medical kit open and untouched beside him. He looked up at us, his green eyes hard with resolve. We remember them by living, by carrying on the fight they can't. We gathered in a loose circle, the living amongst the dead, and for a moment we shared in a silent tribute to our brothers. No words were spoken, but none were needed. Their sacrifice was a language we all understood. As the sky darkened, the temperature plummeted, the cold a relentless enemy that knew no mercy. We huddled together for warmth, our bodies close, our spirits closer. James broke the silence, his voice carrying a new weight. We can't stay here. We're sitting ducks in this valley. We move at first light. Nods met his words, a silent agreement forged in the crucible of shared loss. Chen Wei won't stop, I said, my voice barely audible above the wind. He's out there right now, planning his next move. James's gaze met mine, and in it, I saw the reflection of our own determination. Then we plan ours. We're Marines, we adapt, we overcome. Night claimed the valley, and we claimed what rest we could, knowing that with the dawn would come new challenges. But for now, we lay in our glacial grave, the ghosts of our comrades, our silent sentinels, and we found a strange comfort in their watchful presence. The stars above were a cold light in the darkness, indifferent to the struggles of men. But down here, in the snow and the silence, we held on to something they could never touch, the unbreakable bond of those who stand and fight together, no matter the odds. And as sleep tugged at my consciousness, I clung to the belief that this bond would be enough to see us through the final push that we all knew was coming. Chapter 9, The Icy Maw. James stood before us, his breath visible in the cold air as he mapped out our assault. We hit him hard and fast. Up and over, no stopping until we reached their lines. The men nodded, their faces set in grim determination. I checked my rifle, feeling the familiar weight of it in my hands. Thomas crouched by his radio, his brow furrowed. We'll need to be quick. They'll be on us the moment we break cover. Then we don't give them the chance to think, James replied, his tone brooking no argument. As we moved out, the ground seemed to fight against us, each step a battle against the icy grip of the landscape. We advanced in a tight formation, our breaths hanging like ghosts in the air. The enemy was waiting, their guns a harsh welcome as we charged. Bullets whizzed by, close enough to touch, and the sounds of battle roared in my ears. Close combat came swift and brutal. We fought with bayonets and rifle butts, the clash of metal and the grunts of exertion painting a savage picture. Miguel was beside me, his medic's bag slung over his shoulder, a pistol in his hand. "We can do this," he yelled, his voice full of a fierce hope. We pushed forward, gaining ground, but the enemy was relentless. A Marine fell beside me, and I dragged him to cover, his blood hot against the cold snow. James was a force, leading from the front, his rifle speaking the language of survival. The fight was chaos, a dance with death on a floor of ice and snow. We were in the enemy's teeth now, the icy maw threatening to close on us at any moment. Then came the order that stopped us all cold. If they can't walk, we leave 'em. James's voice carried the weight of command, but the agony of the decision was clear in his eyes. Miguel hesitated, his gaze torn between the fallen and the living. "I can't just leave them, James. We don't have a choice, Doc." James's reply was harsh, the battle stripping away everything but the hard truth. I saw the conflict in Miguel's eyes, the struggle between his duty to save and the orders that condemned. But he nodded, a silent understanding passing between him and James, a pact made in the heart of the fight. We fought on, the encirclement breaking under our assault, but the cost was written in the snow, a crimson testament to the price of our advance. As we regrouped behind the enemy lines, the air was filled with the ragged gasps of the weary and the wounded. We had won the day, but as I looked around at the faces of the men, I saw the descent into tragedy etched into every line. The icy maw had taken its toll, and as we prepared for the next stage of our journey, I knew that the true test was still to come. We were survivors in a world that showed no mercy, and the path ahead promised only more hardship. But we were Marines, and we would face it together, come what may. Chapter 10, The Point of No Return. James, crouched beside me, kept his gaze fixed on the advancing enemy. "Steady, steady," he murmured, his voice a calm in the storm of impending chaos. Miguel, ever the guardian of our battered ranks, passed by, offering a quick nod and a grim smile, his medical bag bouncing against his hip. "Make every shot count, boys. We're running on fumes here." The sound of Thomas's voice broke through the tense air, his usually nervous tone replaced by a sharp edge of urgency. "James, the radio's back up. I got through to command." James's eyes met mine for a brief moment, a spark of hope igniting in the blue depths. "Tommy, you're a lifesaver. Call in our coordinates for air support now." The barrage began, a rattle of sound that shook the frozen earth. We returned fire, the clatter of our rifles a desperate rhythm against the enemy's unyielding advance. Bullets zipped past, close enough to sing the air near my ear. I ducked, my heart pounding, and squeezed off another round. "We can't hold them." The cry came from a young Marine to my left, his rifle trembling in his grip. James shot a glance at the young Marine, his voice rising to be heard over the din. "We hold this line. Fall back to the reservoir, and it's over." The firefight intensified, each pull of the trigger a hope that the next round would turn the tide. But the enemy kept coming, their numbers a relentless flood. Miguel darted from one fallen Marine to another, his face set in a mask of concentration. Stay with me, he chanted, working to stem the flow of blood from a comrade's leg. Ammo boxes were nearly empty, the scant remaining rounds a precious commodity we doled out with care. "Conserve your fire." James's command was punctuated by the sharp crack of his own rifle. I took aim, waited for an enemy soldier to come into view, and fired. The kick of the rifle against my shoulder was a familiar jolt, but the weight of our situation made each shot feel heavier. Thomas's voice rose above the battle once more. "Air support is inbound. Just hold on a little longer." The promise of help from above was a thin thread of hope, but it was enough to steel our resolve. We fought with a ferocity born of desperation, the knowledge that this stand could be our last fueling our defense. As the sky darkened with the approaching aircraft, the enemy's onslaught seemed to falter, their advance slowing under the weight of our tenacity. But the battle was far from over. The enemy regrouped, their counterattack a hammer blow that threatened to shatter our fragile line. "We're not done yet," James yelled, reloading with swift, practiced movements. I nodded, my fingers numb but my aim true, and together we braced for the next wave. The air was filled with the roar of engines and the scream of falling bombs, a sound that shook the very soul. And as the ground erupted around us, I knew that we had reached the point of no return, the moment where our fate would be sealed in fire and blood. Chapter 11: Shattered Spear. James surveyed the hastily constructed walls of snow and ice that served as our only barrier against the enemy. "This is it, men. We make them pay for every inch," he said, his voice cutting through the howling wind. Thomas fiddled with the knobs on the radio, his breath creating a fog on the frost-laden device. "I'm going to get us that air support, James. Just keep those bastards at bay." I crouched beside James. I crossed the mammoth, loading my rifle with the last of my ammunition. "You think the birds will get to us in time?" I asked, watching as the first glimmers of the helicopters appeared like distant stars against the gray sky. "They'll come," James replied, his confidence unwavering, even as the ground trembled with the nearness of our adversary. The enemy came with the ferocity of a storm, their shouts and gunfire a maelstrom that threatened to sweep us away. We returned fire, the reports of our rifles a chorus of defiance. Miguel moved from one injured Marine to the next, his face a mask of determination. "Stay with me," he urged, pressing a bandage to a wound with hands that never seemed to falter. I could hear the chop of helicopter blades now, a rhythmic beating that was the sweetest music to my ears. "They're coming," I yelled, hope surging within me. James nodded, his gaze never leaving the onslaught before us. "All right, we're going to cover each other and fall back to the LZ. Move smart, keep tight." The withdrawal was a dance with death, each step measured, each breath a gasp of frigid air. We moved as one, a unit bound by more than duty, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of war. The helicopters grew louder, their shapes becoming clearer as they drew near. "Almost there," James encouraged, even as a bullet whizzed by his head, a reminder of how close we were to the edge. Thomas's voice was a frantic shout over the radio. "This is Bulldog. We need immediate extraction at the LZ. Do you copy?" The reply was a crackle of static, then clear. "Copy that, Bulldog. We're inbound. Hold tight." Our redoubt was a shattered spear, broken by the might of the enemy, but our will remained unbroken. We fought with the last of our strength, the sight of our salvation in the distance giving us the courage to endure. As we reached the landing zone, the helicopters descended like angels of mercy, their doors open, inviting us to safety. But even as salvation was within our grasp, a new wave of enemy fire erupted. "Go, go," James shouted, pushing Marines ahead of him, ensuring their escape as he returned fire. I boarded the helicopter, the heat from the cabin a glaring disparity to the icy battlefield. As we lifted off, I watched through the open door as James continued to fight, a lone figure against a sea of adversaries. The helicopter banked, and James disappeared from view, the redoubt a fading speck below us. My heart was heavy, the knowledge of his sacrifice a weight that would forever bear down upon my soul. As the distance between us and the battlefield grew, I knew that the chapter we had written there, in that frozen hell, would be etched in history, a tale of bravery, of sacrifice, and of the unyielding spirit of those who stand and fight. But the cost, oh the cost, was a price paid in full by the valor of men like James, whose decisions shaped our destiny at the final standstill. Chapter 12: The Tattered Banner. I lay there staring up at the tattered banner that flapped weakly above us, its fabric worn and edges frayed, much like the men it represented. James moved quietly between the small fires that dotted the camp, his shadow long on the frost-hardened ground. "Can't sleep either, huh?" Thomas's voice came from the darkness beside me. "No, the quiet's too loud," I replied, sitting up to join him by the fire. He nodded, his glasses reflecting the orange glow. "You hear about the Sarge?" I shook my head, the knot in my stomach tightening. "Caught some shrapnel. Doc's with him now, but it don't look good. The news hit like a punch to the gut. Sarge was one of us, a pillar, and now even pillars were crumbling." James overheard and came to sit with us, his face etched with lines of fatigue. "We're going to feel every loss. But remember, we're still here because of men like him." "How do we keep going, James? It's like every step forward costs us," I asked, the words heavy with the weight of our reality. He looked into the fire, the flames dancing in his eyes. "We go on because that's our duty. We owe it to those who can't carry on to carry on for them. Thomas fidgeted with the radio dials, more out of habit than necessity. We're going to run out of owing it soon enough at this rate. James sighed. Then we make every moment, every sacrifice count. We write our story with courage, not with the blood we spill. The cries of the wounded punctuated his words, a grim chorus to our fireside chat. James, you ever wonder what we'll do if we make it back? Thomas's question was a whisper, a flicker of hope in the darkness. We'll live, Tommy. We'll live for them, for us. And we won't ever forget what it took to get back, James said, his voice firm. We sat in silence for a while, each lost in our thoughts, the quiet around us a shroud that held both the promise of dawn and the weight of dusk. The night crept on, and the camp slowly settled, the men finding sleep in snatches, their rest as tattered as the banner above. And as the first light of morning began to seep into the sky, I knew that with each new day came a renewed promise to those we had lost, that we would endure, that we would conquer the field of battle, even as it sought to conquer us. Chapter 13, The Longest Night. James paced between our foxholes, his figure a steady rhythm against the night. Keep your eyes sharp, boys. They're coming, and we're going to give them a greeting they won't forget. Miguel crouched beside me, his medical bag's contents neatly organized, a small island of order in the chaos. Just hope this bag holds out as long as we do, he muttered, checking and rechecking his supplies. Thomas huddled over his radio, a lifeline to a world beyond the encircling darkness. If we can just make it to morning, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. The silence was shattered as flares burst overhead, bathing the battlefield in an eerie, flickering light. The shadows of our men were thrown against the barren landscape, creating a macabre dance of elongated figures on the ground. Here they come, I shouted, my voice hoarse with anticipation. The ground shook with the pounding of boots as the Chinese forces made their final push. We met them with fire, the dissonance of our guns, a desperate symphony played against the backdrop of their advance. Bullets zipped past, carving deadly paths through the air. In the midst of the firefight, a figure emerged from the enemy line, Chen Wei. He stood there, a mere stone's throw away, his eyes locking with James's across the no-man's land that divided us. James, Chen Wei called out, his voice carrying over the din. This doesn't have to be the end. James paused, his rifle lowering just a fraction. It ends when my men are safe, he replied, his voice a roar that matched the battle's intensity. The two leaders stood there, two generals in a war that asked too much of both sides. For a moment, time seemed to stop, the fight around them fading into a blur. Then a flare sputtered and died, and with it, the moment passed. The battle resumed its fever pitch, both sides entwined in a dance of death. As the night wore on, the air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Our ammunition dwindled, our hopes pinned on the promise of dawn's light. The longest night stretched on, each second an eternity, each minute a lifetime. And as the first pale rays of morning began to touch the horizon, we braced for what it would reveal: salvation in the form of reinforcements, or the doom of our final stand. Chapter 14, Dawn's Early Light. James checked his watch, his other hand gripping his rifle. All right, it's now or never. We move fast and hard, stick to the plan, and don't stop for anything. I nodded, my muscles tensed for the sprint ahead. The open terrain before us was a no-man's land that we had to cross to reach our extraction point. Thomas's fingers danced nervously on the radio strapped to his back as he fell in step beside me. Just wish this thing could run as fast as we're about to. Miguel clapped Thomas on the shoulder, his medical kit secured tightly to him. You just keep that radio safe, Thomas. It's our ticket out of here. We exploded into action, our boots pounding the hard earth, each step a thunderous beat in the symphony of our escape. The enemy, caught off guard by the sudden light and our charge, scrambled to man their weapons. Behind us, our comrades laid down a curtain of bullets, their rifles barking fiercely, giving us the precious seconds we needed to make our dash for freedom. The gunfire was a relentless drumbeat at our backs, a reminder of the danger snapping at our heels. I could hear the bullets whistling past, each one a messenger of potential doom. James was a few paces ahead, his figure a torch of determination. His voice carried back to us, urging us on. Keep going. Almost there. The extraction point was in sight now, the silhouettes of our helicopters a beautiful sight against the dawning sky. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but the thought of safety spurred me on. Then, in a moment of calm amidst the storm, I saw him, Chen Wei. Our eyes met across the battlefield, a silent exchange between two warriors. No words were needed. The nod we shared spoke volumes of the respect forged in the fires of conflict. The helicopter's blades chopped at the air, a frenzied whirlwind as we neared the landing zone. We were so close now, the promise of rescue almost a tangible thing I could reach out and grasp. But fate is a fickle master, and as we neared the choppers, an explosion tore through the air, the force of it knocking us to the ground. My ears rang and my vision blurred. I pushed myself up, my body screaming in protest. Through the haze, I saw James rallying the men, his voice a lifeline in the chaos. "We're not done. Move, move, move," he shouted, pulling those who had fallen back to their feet. As the helicopters touched down, their side guns adding to the covering fire, we made one last desperate push. The rescue point was within reach, but the enemy was closing in, a closing jaw we had to escape. We boarded the helicopters under a hail of gunfire, the sound deafening, the danger all too real. And as we lifted off, the ground below us a tapestry of war and sacrifice, I knew that this moment, this escape, was one more step in the tragic journey we had all embarked upon. A journey that would haunt us long after the final standstill. Chapter 15, The Cost of War. All right, this is it. James's voice cut. Chapter 15, The Cost of War. All right, this is it. James's voice cut through the tense air as we hunkered down behind our makeshift defenses. We hold them here, and we get out alive. No heroics, just solid teamwork. Beside me, Thomas clutched his radio, the static from the device a harsh reminder of our connection to a world beyond the battlefield. Just give the word, and I'll have those birds on the ground in a heartbeat. Miguel, his face smeared with grime and resolve, checked his medical supplies one final time. "Let's patch up as many as we can and get them home," he said, the weight of his duty clear in his voice. The horizon erupted in an uproar of gunfire and shouts as the enemy launched their assault. Flares soared overhead, casting an otherworldly glow over the chaos. "We gotta push 'em back," I yelled, firing round after round towards the shadowy figures that surged forward. James nodded sharply before turning to address the men. "Cover me," he shouted then with a determined sprint. He charged forward to meet the enemy, his rifle blazing a path of defiance. It was a moment etched in the ledger of courage, a commander leading from the front to secure a future for his men. We laid down a relentless stream of covering fire, our bullets weaving a protective shroud for James's advance. Thomas's voice crackled over the din, his words punctuated by the staccato rhythm of conflict. "Choppers are inbound. Hold the line." Miguel was a blur of motion, darting between the wounded, his hands steady as he administered aid under fire. "Stay with me, buddy," he soothed, pressing a bandage into the hands of a young Marine. Across the field, in a moment of stark clarity amidst the bedlam, I saw Chen Wei stagger, a bloom of red spreading across his uniform. His eyes met mine, a glint of understanding passing between us as he fell. It was a moment of humanity shared between adversaries, a silent acknowledgement of the cost of war. We fought with the ferocity of those who have nothing left to lose, each trigger pull a record to our determination to see another dawn. As the first of the helicopters touched down, its blades churning the air into a frenzy, we rallied, pulling our wounded to their feet, dragging them towards salvation. James's voice echoed in my ears, a mantra to drive us forward. "Move, now." We stumbled and ran, the promise of escape urging us on. The battlefield was a blur, the sounds and sights melding into a single tapestry of survival. As I clambered aboard the helicopter, the reality of our escape settled over me, a heavy cloak woven from relief and sorrow. We had overcome, but the landscape we left behind was littered with the price of our victory. The chopper lifted off, and I watched through the open door as the battlefield shrank away, the cost of war a stark, indelible mark upon the land and upon our souls. And as the final standstill receded into memory, the knowledge of what had been Chapter 16, The Bitter Retreat. James glanced over the desolate landscape, his face stern, the lines around his eyes deepened by the things he'd seen. "We did what we had to do," he said, more to himself than to me, as we trudged through the muddied snow. Thomas kept close, his radio slung over his shoulder, silent for once. It just feels like we left a part of ourselves back there, doesn't it? He finally spoke, his voice barely above the howl of the wind. I nodded, the weight of his words as heavy as the rifle in my hands. Yeah, it does, I agreed, the cold biting through my jacket and into my bones. Miguel moved off to the side, gathering stones and bits of debris. I'm going to build them a marker, he announced, his tone resolute. They deserve that much. James stopped and turned back to watch Miguel work. They deserve more, but it's a start. We all gathered around as Miguel arranged the stones in a careful pile, each one a silent testament to a life lost. He stood back and saluted the makeshift shrine, his green eyes shining with unshed tears. The silence was broken by the distant sound of another helicopter. That's our ride, James said, his voice cutting through the stillness. Time to go. As we made our way to the landing zone, the reality of our departure settled in. The battlefield, now quiet, was a stark reminder of the cost of war, a cost that was etched into the very earth we walked upon. Thomas's voice broke the silence as we waited for the chopper to land. Did we make a difference, James? Was it worth it? James considered the question, his gaze lingering on the horizon. We may never know, but we fought with honor. That's got to count for something. The chopper touched down, the wind from its blades kicking up a storm of snow around us. We boarded without a word, the thump of the rotors a steady beat against the tumult of thoughts in my head. As we lifted off, I looked down at the battlefield one last time, the snow-covered graves of our comrades growing smaller and smaller. The bitter retreat was ours to bear, a tale of survival, tinged with the sorrow of what-ifs and if-onlys. And as the chopper carried us away from the final standstill, I knew the ghosts of those we left behind would haunt us, their sacrifices a constant echo in the back of our minds. It was the final turn of a story marked by valor and loss, a story that would never truly end as long as we carried its memory in our hearts. Chapter 17, Homeward Bound. James sat across from me, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape, his hands folded tightly together. His eyes, once a piercing blue, now seemed faded, like the color had been drained by the things he had seen. Never thought I'd miss my own bed, Thomas finally said, breaking the quiet that had settled over us like a heavy blanket. I chuckled softly, the sound odd even to my own ears. Yeah, a real mattress sounds like heaven right about now. Miguel leaned back against the metal side of the truck, his medical bag resting by his feet. I just want a hot meal that doesn't come out of a can. We all nodded, each picturing our own small slice of normalcy. But as the miles rolled by, so did the silence, creeping back in as we considered the friends who wouldn't be returning to such comforts. You think they're at peace? Thomas asked, his voice low, as if afraid to disturb the hush. James turned his head, his eyes meeting mine before answering. I like to think so. They gave everything. They've earned it. The truck hit a pothole, jostling us, a jarring bounce that echoed the turmoil inside us. We were homeward bound, but the journey was bittersweet. As the first familiar landmarks of home came into view, my heart clenched. The buildings, the streets, they were all the same, but we were different, changed in ways that no one on the outside could understand. Miguel sighed heavily. You ever wish you could erase what you've seen? Just wipe it clean? Every day, I admitted. But then I think of the guys who didn't make it back, and I feel like remembering is the least I can do for them. James nodded slowly, his eyes back on the passing scenery. We carry them with us, in our memories, in our hearts. That's how we honor them. The truck slowed as we approached the base, the final stop before we could truly say we were home. It was a place of mixed emotions, where relief at our return was shadowed by the weight of loss. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. It's going to be strange, walking back into the world after all of that. James let out a long breath, his chest rising and falling with the weight of command. We'll get through it, just like we did out there. The truck came to a stop, and we were met with the sight of the base, a hub of activity and life. It was a distinct separation to the stillness of the battlefield we had left behind. We disembarked, our boots hitting the pavement with a finality that rang through the air. I looked back at the truck, then at James, who gave a solemn nod, acknowledging the end of our journey and the beginning of another. The base was alive with the sounds of home, but in my mind the echoes of war still rang. As we walked towards the barracks, I knew that the final chapter of this story was still unwritten, the last turn of our tragic cliffhanger yet to be revealed. Chapter 18, The Echoes That Remain. "Can't believe they're really gone," Thomas muttered beside me, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice barely audible over the somber hum of the gathered crowd. "Yeah," I replied, my gaze fixed on the flag-draped caskets that were the centerpiece of the ceremony. "But we're here to make sure they're remembered." Miguel joined us, his uniform adorned with a new ribbon, but his usual vibrancy was muted. "They'd have done the same for us," he said, his eyes scanning the sea of mourners. James, standing tall and solemn, approached the podium to speak. His voice, clear and strong, carried across the cemetery. "Today, we honor the sacrifice of those who gave their all. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and we remember their valor." The crowd listened, hanging on to every word, each syllable a tribute to the fallen. When the ceremony concluded, the silence was heavy, filled with the weight of what had been and what could have been. As we dispersed, families clustered around their returned loved ones. I watched as James was enveloped by a sea of embraces, his wife and children clinging to him as if they could hold back the tide of memories that threatened to pull him under. "Hey, look at James," Thomas nudged me, a bittersweet smile on his face. "Yeah, he's finally home," I said, my heart aching with a mix of joy for him and sorrow for those who had no homecoming. Miguel clapped a hand on my shoulder, his touch grounding. "We all carry scars, some just aren't on the surface." The reunion was bittersweet, laughter and tears intermingling, the echoes of the past a constant whisper beneath the veneer of the present. As the day waned, uncertainty cast long shadows across our hearts. The broader conflict, the war beyond our war, raged on, a storm on the horizon we could all feel but not see. We did good, right? Thomas's question was one we all grappled with, a search for affirmation in a world that had shifted beneath our feet. "We did what we had to," James replied, his eyes meeting each of ours. "And we'll keep doing it, for them, for us, for the future." The sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in hues of purple and orange, as we stood together, a band of brothers bound by the trials we had endured. And as night fell, the echoes that remained were a haunting melody, a cliffhanger that spoke of battles won and the unknown battles yet to come. Chapter 19, The War Within. I squatted down, tracing the letters of his name with my fingertips. "Hey, James," I started, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "It's been a rough ride without you." The graveyard was silent, save for the occasional bird song and the rustling of leaves. It was a peacefulness that felt foreign to me, a contrast to the discord of the battlefield that still rang in my ears at night. I was about to rise when I heard footsteps approaching. Turning, I saw Thomas, his hair a bit longer than I remembered, his eyes still carrying the shadows of war. "Morning," he greeted, a half smile on his face as he joined me beside the grave. "Morning, Thomas. How's it going?" He shrugged, his gaze not leaving the headstone. "You know, good days, bad days. The usual." We both knew what the usual meant. It was the silence that spoke volumes, the sudden flinches at unexpected noises, the long nights staring at the ceiling. "Got something the other day," Thomas said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "It's from Chen Wei's family." I felt a pang in my chest. "Really? What did they say?" His fingers worked the envelope, a bit hesitant. They thanked us, said Chen Wei respected us, considered us worthy opponents. That respect was something that transcended the lines drawn in the dirt, the uniforms we wore. It was a soldier's respect, something pure amid the chaos. "It's strange," I mused, "how you can feel connected to someone you only knew in battle." Thomas nodded. "War's strange like that. Makes you rethink a lot of things." We stood in silence for a while, lost in our thoughts, the air around us thick with the unspoken words and memories of those who had fallen. A sudden gust of wind sent a chill down my spine, and I looked up at the sky, gray clouds gathering on the horizon. "Looks like a storm's coming," I observed, the metaphor not lost on either of us. "Yeah." Thomas's voice was quiet. "Feels like there's always one on the way." We made our way out of the cemetery, the letter from Chen Wei's family, a reminder of the connections forged in the heat of battle, the shared understanding between soldiers, even those on opposing sides. As we reached the gate, I took one last look back at the graves, the white stones standing like sentinels. The war was over, but the battles we fought within ourselves raged on, a different kind of conflict that required a different kind of courage. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, blurring the headstones into a wash of gray, I knew that our story, the story of the final standstill, was far from over. The war within was just beginning, and where it would lead us was a cliffhanger that each of us would have to face in our own way. The end. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the final standstill. Please smash that like button, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for daily storytelling adventures.